Somewhere right now, at maybe 2 in the morning, you are lying in bed with your phone resting on your chest, the screen already dark, and you are not asleep. You are not scrolling, you are just still. And somewhere in that stillness, a thought moves through you like a shadow crossing a wall. Something like, why does everything feel so heavy when nothing is technically wrong? You have food, you have a roof, you have a phone that connects you to every human being on the planet. And yet, there is this quiet ache that does not have a name, this sense of standing at the edge of something enormous and not knowing whether to step forward or turn back. You are not broken, you are not ungrateful, you are just living in a world that no one has ever lived in before, and no one gave you the map. That is where this begins, not with statistics, not with generations defined by birth years, not with debates about whether you are too sensitive or too entitled or too online. It begins here, in the dark, with you, and the weight of being alive in a time that moves faster than human beings were ever built to move. Breathe for a moment, just let that land. You probably have a very specific relationship with the phrase figuring it out. You hear it a lot. Adults say it to you like it is a comfort, like it is something they did too and survived, and maybe they did. But what they do not always say is that when they were figuring it out, the world held still long enough for them to find their footing. They had maybe 1 or 2 options for what a life could look like. They had communities that were physical, neighbors who knew their names, career paths that were linear. They did not have to decide at 22 years old whether to optimize their personal brand, choose between 47 possible career trajectories, perform wellness on social media, grieve climate anxiety, process collective trauma from a global pandemic, and also somehow figure out how to afford rent in a city where a 1-bedroom apartment costs more than their parents' first house. You are not doing the same thing your parents did. You are doing something that has never been done before. And the strange thing is, you already knew that. You have always felt it, even if you could not name it. That feeling of being somehow both overexposed and completely unseen. That experience of knowing everything and understanding nothing. That exhaustion of having more information than any generation in history, and yet feeling profoundly lost. Let's stay with that for a moment, because it matters more than it first appears. Think about the way you consume information, not just casually, but the way your mind works now. You can hold 12 different perspectives on a single topic simultaneously. You can see the nuance in almost anything. You learned, probably by the time you were 15, that every story has at least 2 sides, that systems are corrupt, that people are complicated, that the heroes have shadows, and the villains have backstories. You were handed radical empathy and radical skepticism at the same time, in the same scroll, on the same afternoon. That is not a small thing to carry. There is a term in psychology called cognitive overload, and it describes what happens when the brain is asked to process more information than it can meaningfully integrate. But the version you are living is not just cognitive. It is emotional. It is moral. It is existential. You are not overloaded with data. You are overloaded with meaning, with weight, with the sense that everything connects to everything else. And if you pull one thread, the whole thing might unravel. So sometimes you do not pull any threads at all. You go still. You scroll past. You say you are fine, and you mean it in the most complicated way a person has ever meant that word. Pause here for a second, because what comes next might be the thing no one has ever said to you out loud. The generation before yours and the one before that were largely taught that feelings are obstacles, that you process emotion by moving through it quickly, by not making a scene, by getting on with it. Men especially, but not only men, were taught that the body does not need to be consulted, that you think your way through problems, that productivity is identity, that rest is laziness, that needing help is weakness. You were raised by people who believed those things or who were trying to unlearn them. And here's where it gets tender. Some of you grew up watching your parents perform okayness while clearly not being okay. You learned to read the room before you learned to read a book. You became the emotional weather reporter of your household, sensing shifts in pressure before the storm arrived, adjusting your behavior accordingly, shrinking yourself to keep the peace, becoming someone who was extraordinarily attuned to everyone else's needs, and almost completely illiterate about your own. Psychologists call this parentification. It happens when a child takes on emotional or practical responsibilities that belong to adults, and it does not always look dramatic. It does not require abuse or crisis. Sometimes it just looks like a kid who always knew when not to ask for something. A kid who became very good at being low maintenance. A kid who turned into an adult who still hesitates before expressing a need, who says sorry before asking for help, who genuinely cannot tell the difference between a preference and a requirement. If any part of that just made your chest tighten, stay with it. You do not have to rush past it, because the thing about growing up hyper-aware of the room is that it gave you gifts, real ones. You probably read people well. You are probably thoughtful, perceptive, someone others trust. You can sense when something is off before anyone says a word. You have a kind of emotional intelligence that was trained, the way a muscle is trained, through years of careful observation. But the cost is that you can read everyone else's emotional state with remarkable accuracy and have almost no access to your own. You are fluent in other people and a stranger to yourself, and that manifests in ways you might not immediately connect. It shows up as difficulty making decisions because decisions require knowing what you want, and somewhere along the way you stopped asking yourself what you want. It shows up as a tendency to over-explain yourself, to preemptively apologize, to qualify every opinion before you share it, to wonder constantly whether what you feel is valid or whether you are being too much. It shows up in relationships where you give abundantly and receive awkwardly, where intimacy feels easier when you are the one doing the holding. It shows up in the way you treat rest, like it has to be earned, like you need to prove enough output before you are allowed to stop. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this, not the tiredness that sleep fixes, the deeper kind, the kind that sits in your bones even after a full night of sleep, because it is not your body that is tired. It is the part of you that has been monitoring, managing, adjusting, and performing since you were small. I am not tired of doing things. I am tired of the performing. That sentence, sit with it for a moment, because here is the twist that most conversations about Gen Z miss entirely. The discourse tends to frame your generation as either victims of a broken world or the entitled children of excess. And both of those narratives are doing the same thing. They are making you into an object, something that happened to, something to be explained, categorized, solved. But you are not a symptom, you are a response. Every defining characteristic that gets assigned to your generation, the difficulty with traditional authority, the rejection of hustle culture, the need for psychological safety at work, the discomfort with hierarchy that is not earned, the fluency with identity, and the willingness to hold it loosely, none of that appeared out of nowhere. All of it is a coherent, logical response to a world that was handed to you, already on fire. You did not create the late-stage economic anxiety that means the median home price in the United States now sits somewhere around $400,000. You did not design the social media platforms that were optimized by engineers with PhDs to be as neurologically addictive as possible before you were old enough to consent to using them. You did not start the wars, or ignore the science, or build the systems that were already cracking by the time you were old enough to inherit them. You walked into a room that was already complicated, and instead of pretending it was not, you said, "I can see what is happening here." And that honesty, that refusal to perform normalcy in the face of genuine abnormality, is one of the most psychologically sophisticated things a generation can do. It is also one of the loneliest, because the people who built the room do not always want to hear that something is wrong with it. And being the one who can see clearly, in a world that rewards pleasant blindness, is its own particular kind of isolation. I stopped pretending everything was fine. I did not expect how alone that would feel. Let that breathe. Now we go one layer deeper, and this is the layer most people stop short of. There is something happening in your relationship with time that is unlike anything previous generations experienced, and it is quietly reshaping how you understand identity, ambition, and belonging. Previous generations had what you might call a synchronized clock. There was a timeline: school, then work, then marriage, then children, then house, then retirement. The timeline was not perfect. It was exclusionary in enormous ways, but it was a timeline. And timelines, even oppressive ones, give the nervous system something to orient toward. They create a sense of forward motion, of benchmarks, of knowing whether you are on track. Your generation does not have a synchronized clock. You have 1,000 clocks, all showing different times, all claiming to be correct. One voice says, build a career in something stable. Another says, follow your passion. Another says, passive income. Another says, the economy is so broken that traditional employment is a trap. Another says, community matters more than individual success. Another says the planet has maybe 30 years before certain systems fail, so why are you optimizing a 5-year plan? And underneath all of that noise is a question that previous generations rarely had to confront so early and so nakedly. What is a life for? That question is not neurotic. It is not a symptom of mental illness. It is an extraordinarily mature question that your generation is being forced to answer without the scaffolding that previous generations had, without religion in many cases, which provided a ready-made answer for millions of people for thousands of years, without community in the physical, daily, unplanned sense, without the luxury of not knowing, because you have already read every possible framework for meaning on the internet by the age of 19. Psychologists working with your generation increasingly describe something called existential precarity, a state where the foundational assumptions that normally hold a life together, the sense that the future is roughly predictable, that effort leads to reward, that belonging is available, that institutions can be trusted, feel unreliable or absent. And existential precarity does not just affect your mood. It affects how you attach to other people. It affects how much of yourself you are willing to invest in anything, because investing requires believing the ground will hold. This is why so many of you describe a curious emotional numbness. Not depression exactly, not sadness exactly, more like a glass wall between you and your own life. You are present, functioning, even laughing, but there is a faint distance, as though you are watching yourself live rather than fully inhabiting the living. That distance is not a personality flaw. It is a nervous system response to chronic, low-grade uncertainty. It is what happens when the body has been braced for a very long time. And then we arrive at the real heart of it, the thing that no one talks about clearly enough. The thing that lives at the center of why your generation is so different, and why that difference costs something profound. You were the first generation to grow up fully inside the mirror, not just with access to cameras or social media, fully inside it. You formed your identity in an environment where identity was performed before it was discovered, where you could see yourself from the outside before you had fully become yourself from the inside, where feedback, in the form of likes and comments and shares, arrived in real time, shaping your choices and your self-concept before you were old enough to have a stable self to protect. Previous generations had the privacy of being boring teenagers in small rooms, the privacy of making mistakes that were witnessed only by a handful of people, the privacy of trying on a version of yourself that was bad or cringe or confused, and then quietly setting it down and trying something else. You did not have that. You grew up in a panopticon of your own construction, watched and watching, performing and consuming performance, learning very quickly that certain selves were more receivable than others, and adjusting, always adjusting, because the feedback loop never stopped. And here is the paradox that breaks something open. The generation that is most publicly expressive of emotion is also one of the most privately disconnected from it. The generation that is most fluent in the language of psychology and healing and inner work is also one of the most likely to use that language as a performance of healing rather than healing itself. Not from dishonesty, from genuine confusion about the difference, because when you have never experienced a private self, it is very hard to know what it would feel like to heal in private, to change without an audience, to become without documentation. I know all the words for what I am feeling. I just do not always feel them. That is the sentence. That is the one. That is the thing that lives at the center of everything. And if you recognize it, then you already know that what you are looking for is not more information. It is not another framework, another podcast, another thread about attachment theory or nervous system regulation or the inner child. Those things have value, but they are not the destination. The destination is something quieter, something that does not require an audience. It is the moment when you stop explaining your healing and start living it. When you let yourself be changed by something without immediately narrating the change. When you allow a feeling to move through you without immediately posting it, analyzing it, contextualizing it, or performing it. This is not a criticism. This is a recognition that what your generation is reaching for, underneath all the therapy speak and the online vulnerability and the careful curation, is something very ancient and very simple. To be known, not followed. Known, and knowing requires stillness. It requires presence. It requires the willingness to be in the room with yourself without immediately reaching for your phone. That is harder than it sounds. Because the phone, and everything it carries, was designed by some of the most brilliant minds in human history to be more immediately rewarding than interior silence. You are not weak for finding it difficult. You are human, swimming against an extraordinarily engineered current. But here is what is also true. You are the most psychologically literate generation in history. You grew up learning words for experiences that your grandparents could not even conceptualize. You grew up understanding that systems shape people, that trauma is real, that emotions are data, that identity is fluid and complex and worthy of gentleness. You grew up with a kind of compassion for human complexity that your ancestors had to work decades to arrive at, if they arrived at all. That literacy is not nothing. It is actually everything. It is the foundation of something that has never quite existed in the same form before. A generation that begins the work of self-understanding early enough to actually change the patterns before they calcify. Previous generations often did not begin that work until something broke. A marriage, a health crisis, a breakdown at 45. You are doing it at 22, not because you are more virtuous, but because the world handed you the vocabulary and the urgency at the same time. I did not choose to grow up this fast, but I am learning what to do with it. The path forward, and it is not a straight path and it is not a fast one, begins with a distinction that sounds simple and is actually profound: the difference between processing and integrating. Processing is what happens in the mind. It is the analysis, the naming, the understanding, and you are exceptional at it. Genuinely, you can process an experience with clarity and articulateness that most people spend a lifetime developing. Integration is what happens in the body, in the patterns, in the slow rewiring of reflexes that were laid down when you were small and frightened and doing your best. Integration cannot be rushed. It cannot be performed. It cannot happen while you are watching yourself have it happen. It requires, above almost everything else, time that is ungoverned, time that does not need to be productive, time that is allowed to be boring, aimless, even uncomfortable. Time that is yours, not because you earned it, but because you exist. This is the quiet revolution your generation is actually engaged in, even if it does not always look like one from the outside. The refusal to equate worth with output. The insistence that rest is not laziness. The demand for psychological safety, not as a luxury, but as a baseline. The willingness to say, I am not okay, and that is information, not failure. These are not soft things. These are the hardest things. They require standing against centuries of cultural conditioning that says your value is what you produce, and they require a kind of tenderness toward yourself that was not modeled for most of you. That tenderness is not something you find. It is something you practice, quietly, privately, imperfectly, over a very long time. It starts with something very small. Maybe it starts with noticing, just noticing, the moment when you reach for your phone because a feeling arrived that you did not want to feel. Not judging it, not fixing it, just seeing it, saying, there it is. That is the feeling I was about to scroll past. And then sometimes, just sometimes, letting it stay long enough to tell you something. Your inner life is not a problem to be solved. It is a landscape to be inhabited. And no one can do that inhabiting for you. No therapist, no algorithm, no community, no relationship, as necessary and as valuable as all of those things can be. There is a room inside you that only you can enter, and the door has probably been locked for a while. You do not have to break it down. You do not have to storm the room. You can just stand outside it for a while, put your hand on the door, notice that it is there. That is already something. That is already more than you might know. Come back now to where we started. 2 a.m, phone on your chest, that unnamed weight. You were not imagining it. The weight is real. The world you inherited is genuinely harder in specific ways than the world your parents inherited. The anxiety is not weakness. The exhaustion is not laziness. The confusion is not ingratitude. It is the honest, reasonable, human response to growing up inside a transformation so large that no generation has ever navigated it before, and you are doing it anyway, imperfectly, messily, sometimes by scrolling for 3 hours, and then crying without knowing why, sometimes by getting out of bed on a Tuesday morning and deciding to try again. You are doing it. The difference between your generation and the ones that came before is not that you are softer. It is that you are honest about the weight in a way that previous generations were taught to deny. And honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it costs you something, is always the first step toward anything real. So here is what gets left open, because some things should not be wrapped up neatly. You do not know yet what kind of person you are becoming. None of us do, fully, at any age, but you are becoming someone shaped by all of this, by the weight and the confusion and the grief and the strange beauty of being alive in the most complex moment in human history. Someone who learned empathy not from a textbook, but from needing it. Someone who learned resilience not from being told to toughen up, but from continuing anyway, quietly, on the days when continuing felt like the bravest possible act. The map does not exist yet, but then it never did. Every generation walks into the dark eventually. What is different about yours is that you already know the dark is there. You are not surprised by it, and there is a kind of strange courage in that, in having your eyes open, in refusing the comfortable lie, in standing in the uncertainty without pretending it is certainty. You are 22 or 25 or 29 years old, and you are carrying questions that philosophers spent their whole lives not answering. You are holding grief that is personal and also collective. You are reaching for connection in a world that commodified it. You are looking for meaning in a world that keeps trying to sell it back to you. And you keep going. The phone on your chest, the dark ceiling above you, the unnamed feeling that woke you at 2 a.m. That is not emptiness. That is you listening. That is you still paying attention, still here. The ones who feel the weight of the world most deeply are often the ones quiet enough to hear it breathe. Go gently.